Graham, it's all you.
All right. Well, thank you, Ryan. Thanks everybody for joining me, joining us tonight here. This is our fifth and final Takodah history talk for season one, I guess we'll call it. But we're joined by lots of really great people tonight, including Buffalo Bob's sister, Dennis Stevens there, who I had the honor of volunteering with a couple of times there at minicamp. Dennis, good to see you. Mike, as always, Jonathan, Taylor, and Jen as well. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is the origin of the current names of our divisions. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Just a couple of things for you to keep in mind is that, thank you, Ryan, is I may jump around a couple of things tonight. So I'll be sharing these slides and talking. And by the way, Ryan is right. Interrupt me whenever you want. And this is a very casual, interactive thing, so feel free to interrupt. But I'm going to share some slides. I may also share some photographs so I can jump around and do a little bit of that. But tonight we're going to focus on the origin behind Buffalo, Crowninshield, and Kingfisher divisions. And let's just start by enjoying the photograph that's on the screen right now. So as you can see, this is Ken Kingfish Klatka at one of his coronation ceremonies, being serenaded by Robert Buffalo Bob Smith, the man himself, during girls' camp. They're on the back deck behind Hobby Nook. And it's just a very Camp Takodah, wonderful little moment that is captured here. You can see Kingfish is in his costume. Buff is playing along. They're having a nice little dinner. And when I found this photo, you know, I just loved it. And the other thing I love about this photo is a lot of the chairs, just the chairs that you see here, are actually still in use at camp today. And we have lots of things like that where our history is still very much alive. Now, I know some of you have seen this 5 times, but because these are being recorded for posterity, I'll quickly just go through who I am. I'm Graham Noseworthy. I'm a holder of a CT-16. Should have been 17, but as you all know, we had to make a very difficult decision to shutter camp for the season due to COVID-19. I was a camper in the 1980s. I am the parent of 2 current campers. I'm a 1-week program cabin dad. I've been lucky enough to volunteer, like I said, with Dennis, for example, which was a ton of fun. I'm a Project 141 and COVID-19 response fundraiser. And it's really easy if you go to camptakodah.org and click donate. We'd love to see that. And I'm the vice president of the Takodah YMCA. I have studied our archives going back to 1913, read just about every piece of paper I can get my hands on, and I've authored quite a few articles, and so it's a lot of fun to do this. But where does all this stuff come from, right? A lot of it is the stories that Takodians tell and share with me, which is incredibly helpful. A lot of that stuff can be conflicting and at times difficult to confirm. So we use the original documents going all the way back to December the 8th, 1913, when we were founded, when our Y was founded. Our board meeting books and record books. I have some of them in the room with me, some downstairs. They're in our archives at Lake Street, and they're even some of them at camp right now. I work a lot with the former executive directors, especially Uncle Jeff, who contributed a lot of stuff for tonight, which is great. Personal testimonies. We also use federal, state, local, and town records, newspapers, the Historical Society of Cheshire County, and the Y Archives. But even with all of that, we're not always right. We try to triple confirm, but sometimes it takes more than that. So, as I always like to say, if you see something that's not right, especially you, Barbara, I want to know because I want to make that fix. Now, our agenda for this evening, we're going to talk about the original division names, and then we're going to talk about where the current division names got their names from. So we'll dive into the biographies, and I'll share something special for each person, including Buffalo Bob, Elsie Crowninshield, Martie Fisher. Oops, see, Ryan, I spelled it wrong there. Now I got to fix it. I don't know why. I can't get past that Y. Ken Kingfish Klatka, and then I'll take some questions and share something new. Now, Can anyone guess, and if you've heard it on one of my previous talks, it's okay for you to say it, but can anyone guess the original names of the divisions, the 3 divisions of camp? Does anybody know the original divisions? And I'll give you a hint. It's not the previous set. Going once, going twice. All right. Well, camp was, was someone going to guess?
Is it Iroquois?
Ooh, that's not correct, but that is a good one. Iroquois was actually temporarily used to name the leadership division when it was Cherokee, Monadnock, and Pennacook.
Okay, sorry.
But the original, that was a good guess. That was a good guess. Camp was divided into formal divisions for the first time in the summer of 1933. Indian Village, or Buffalo, as we now call it, was for ages 8.5 to 10 years old. This next one is my favorite, the Stockade, which just cracks me up every time. The Stockade, or now known as Crowninshield, was for ages 11 to 13. And the oldest campers went to the Frontier, or Kingfisher, as we call it these days, before graduating to the highly acclaimed Leadership and Staff program, which has been renowned in the area for quite some time. And Taylor, that is the division that eventually was temporarily known as Iroquois. Now, in the 30s and 40s, it was an era of rapid expansion, substantial investment, constant fundraising, which Uncle Oscar was a master of, and improved programming in Richmond. The Native American-inspired division names that we all remember, probably most of us on the phone, Cherokee, Monadnock, and Pennacook, they actually didn't come along until much later. So there's kind of a misunderstanding that those were the names sort of forever. They actually were not. I cannot pinpoint when they started. I think it was in the 50s, but I am still working to actually confirm that. Now, I'm sure everybody here knows, but let's just make sure we all remember where the divisions are. So obviously you're looking at a map of camp. You can orient yourself pretty well by realizing this is B field, this is A field, this is MEM. The Buffalo division is right at the edge of B field and has its own twins here. It's just behind the tennis courts. The Crowninshield division is roughly where the draft tree is kind of at the center of it, right? You got some cabins near the tennis courts, and then a couple of more cabins over here by the Crowninshield twins, which we are working to replace, by the way, which is interesting because that's one of the oldest buildings on camp. And then the Kingfisher division is over here at the end of A field, near where you would walk to the point in archery range. I know we all know that, but it's important just to make sure we're all on the same page for those divisions. All right, let's explore the names. We're going to start with Robert Buffalo Bob Smith, who was the proud holder of a CT-10. And I love these photos of Buffalo Bob. They're just pure buff, right? Here he is in the upper left corner, playing in a band just on the side of what we now call T-Pack. But at that time, even when I was a camper, in fact, I may have watched him do that. That was the dining hall. The upper right corner, you could see Buffalo, and I love the fact that there's a like a tennis racket or something that's in one of those frames in the window, like somebody left it in there. I love the picture on the lower left. Have you been buffed today is his shirt. And obviously he's got a big kick out of it. And of course he was great friends with Uncle Jeff. And I love this picture of the two of them embracing. Let's talk a little bit about Buff's bio. You can see he's pictured here with his beloved dog, Ace. So Robert Smith graduated Springfield College in May of 1976. He joined the Takodah family that summer, serving as the association's program director. And in fact, Fred Toot recruited him right out of Springfield College. Now, for those of you that don't know, Springfield College it's where Y professionals come from. It's where we have a long history of getting Y professionals from Springfield College. It's where Uncle Oscar went. It's where, I mean, when we get to Kingfish, Klatka, we'll talk about him as well. If you want to be a Y professional, Springfield College in Springfield, Massachusetts is where you go, and that's where Buff came from. He joined as a program director. He was actually both county program services and Camp Takodah. In 1978, he became the first year-round resident on Takodah, and he lived in Big Pine Cabin along with adorable little Ace there. And it's important to note that before Buff was doing this, camp was just shuttered from, I think it was like October to May. I mean, other than a winter reunion, there was nobody there. And that's when having caretakers, people like Harold Dickinson, Dick Dickinson, and others who would come in and inspect camp on a regular basis. But I mean, literally, it was boarded up, shut down, and everybody left. And so Buff was really the first person. Now Ryan lives there, Carly, and there's all kinds of people who come and go and live on camp's property and have for a long time. But Buff was the first. Now he served with 5 directors: Fred Toot, who recruited Buff out of Springfield; Jeff Craig, who he formed a real powerful friendship with. Well, Buffalo formed friendships with lots of people. Lotta Johnson, Steve Russell, and Bill Allen. Now, you have to understand that when you've served with that many directors, you have an incredibly important legacy and mark that you leave on our programs. You know, different administrations function in different ways, but Buff brought an incredible amount of value to each and every one of those. And I've read the documents. They all talk about him with great, great admiration. Buff's name and the records relating to him are all over our archives, and it's really wonderful. So he really left his mark as a very competent leader of program staff teams. And with Buff, just like everyone you're going to hear tonight, a lot of the stuff he created, not just the songs, but the stuff that he created, is all very much in use today. In 1984, Bob became associate camp director and administered day-to-day or day and travel camping programs. And in 1985, he actually became the day-to-day operations director for YMCA Camp Takodah, which, as Ryan and you know others can tell you, is a very, very big and demanding job. Now, Bob did pass away on Takodah property in November of 1985. He was laid to rest behind the altar in Elwell Chapel, but he has been since moved to rest with his parents in Hollis, New Hampshire. And I can tell you, I actually remember being told by my parents that Buffalo Bob had passed away. I actually recall that. Now, Bob wrote and performed poetry and music. In fact, if you Google Takodah SoundCloud and you click on the first link that comes up, you can scroll to Wicker Arm Chairs and you can hear Buff actually sing Wicker Arm Chairs. And what's fascinating about that is it's just a little different from the way in which we sing it now. It's actually evolved a little bit over time, which I'm sure Buffalo would have loved. But it's really powerful to go back and hear the man's voice. He was a beautiful musician and a beautiful singer. He was also a poet as well. Now, he wrote Wicker Arm Chair shortly before his passing, and as most of you know, we perform that. We all sing that as a camp at every single session of camp, and we have, I mean, going all the way back to 85 or 86 really is probably when we would have started singing it. And I certainly recall that. If you go into Gruby Library and you go into the back of the library, you can see some of Buff's personal items are there today. Now, this is something that I found in the archives, and I wanted to share this with you. What you see on the screen here is a letter that Buff sent to the board of directors on the 11th of February in 1981. And it's very short, and it's very interesting the way it's written, but it's essentially the story of someone saying, I wanted to rise to the challenge and be something bigger and better than I thought I could be. So he says, nearly full 5 years ago, I wrote to you in response to a job vacancy listed at the Springfield College Placement Office. Several months later, I had a full day, believe me, it was full, interview, after which I returned home and wrote a short thank you note for the privilege of being considered as an applicant for this program director position. Man, as somebody who hires people, let me tell you, that's the way to do it. As I knew I would be sitting at home tonight, sunk deeply in meditation, I thought I would share my opening thoughts in the form of an updated thank you letter. Thank you for 5 of the greatest, most exciting, and most educational years of my life. Thank you for allowing me to work alongside 4 such capable, concerned, committed YMCA people, and for the privilege of serving the board of directors, our volunteer base, and the constituents of our service area to the best of my ability. Thank you, too, for the pushes and kicks when I needed them, and the praises and rewards if and when I deserved them. That's a very powerful and humble statement he made there. I cannot imagine being happier, more fulfilled, or being in a better learning and growing situation than I presently am. Sincerely, Bob Smith. Now, I want to point out the line he crossed out, because I was struck by this and found it very interesting that he crossed it out, and yet it made it into our records. I know very few of my close friends in high school or college who can say the same. Now, we'll never know why Buff crossed that out. But what we see here is the story of someone who is figuring out who they really are, taking the time to give thanks along the way, and realizing that you have to earn what's given to you, right? And that is one of the reasons we honor Bob with the Buffalo Division. And I just found this letter to be really, really, really powerful and wanted to share it with you tonight. Now, I'm going to share one more thing from Buff, and then, Barbara, I'm going to see if you want to jump in. You certainly do not have to, but you should feel free to do so. I want to share this picture because I think Buff would just love this. This is the Buffalo Division gathered in at the Buffalo Fire Pit. I actually just noticed that this child right here wearing the hat is actually my child. Dennis, one of yours may be in here too, actually. I have to look a little closer. But in the center, you can see Tom Heenahan, who was the division, Buffalo division head that year, with his CTs on. And what is he wearing? A big Buffalo hat. And we say, "Where's the herd at?" And everybody goes, "Oof!" And it's great. So I can totally imagine Buff standing on the edge there, getting a kick out of that. I'm going to pause and I'm going to see if anyone has any questions or stories or anything to add about Buffalo Bob Smith.
So Graham, we did get one question, sort of wondering how it came about that he was initially laid to rest at camp and then later moved, and you know, maybe why he wasn't laid to rest in the place where he finally was eventually, and you know, just sort of how that.
Sure.
I can sort of answer that.
Yep, you go ahead.
Well, of course, it was a huge shock when he died, and Bill Allen came over to tell me about it at work. I worked at Antioch Graduate School at the time, so Bill came over, and I thought, that's weird. What's he coming over here for? And so anyway, he told me that Bob had died, and so we went and told my parents, and they were just in shock, and it was terrible. But Bill, I believe, was the one who had the idea of taking him to camp. And then when my dad passed away about 12 years ago, my mother thought that it would be appropriate to take Bob to be with Dad, and eventually she'll be there also in Hollis. So
can I just jump in for a second? I'm Barbara's daughter, so Bob is my uncle.
Right.
One quick note of correction, just for accuracy's sake. Bob's mother, my grandmother, is still alive. She's 98 years old.
and a half.
and a half. So she is still alive, and so it's just Grandpa that's up there right now. Grandma
Thank you. I
does
just changed that.
being up there eventually,
and that's East Cemetery in Hollis.
Yes, yes.
Do you know how he got the nickname Buffalo?
Actually, I'm not sure, and I was hoping you'd tell us
Well,
that.
I can tell you. When we were kids many years ago, the dawn of time, there was a TV show called Howdy Doody. And it was hosted by a man who wore a kind of a cowboy suit, and he was Buffalo Bob Smith. So then that's how Bob became Buffalo, because of Buffalo Bob Smith on TV. And there was a funny little moment I had, must have been maybe about a year before he died or something, I don't know, but he had had a beard ever since high school. So I never saw him without a beard. And one day I took my kids to camp, and we were waiting in line to get registered and everything. And there was this guy over across the way. And I thought, gee, he looks familiar. I couldn't figure out who it was. And it was my brother, and he had shaved off his beard, and I didn't recognize him.
Oh, that's a great story. I love that. I have a question for you, Barbara. So I noticed on the gravestone that's at the East Cemetery in Hollis, and Diane, thank you for clarifying that with the father. I want to make sure we get this right. I noticed that there's a Canadian flag on the gravestone, or it looks like a maple leaf.
That's Mom. My mother was Canadian, so she needed to have something that signified her, which was the Canadian flag, and something for Dad, which is an airplane. And I think, is there a buffalo on that stone also?
There is.
Yeah.
There is. Yeah.
And then if you notice, there's also a small stone, I guess just east of that. It's in the same block of 4 graves. You had to buy 4 plots, I think. And my sister Margaret is still alive, but my mother gave her that plot, so she had a little stone made up. And it has her name, Margaret Williamson, on it. So that's my brother's sister.
Got it. Yes. So, right. Okay. Oh, right. I see. I'm actually looking at a picture of it now. I see the airplane. I see the flag. I clearly see that your mother only has her birth date. So yeah, now it's really obvious to me. I wish I'd known it. But I asked about the Canadian flag because my parents are Canadian. So whenever I see a maple leaf, it jumps right out. So anything else about Buff that any other questions or anything else, Barbara, anything else you wanted to share? He
used to call me when I worked at Antioch in Keene, and my parents loved to visit more than, I mean, we were at work and they would just kind of drop in. So he would call me and I'd pick up the phone and say, Antioch, New England Graduate School. And he'd say, red alert, red alert. And that meant my parents were coming. So watch out.
Oh my God, that's great.
I wonder if they ever knew that. I don't know that they knew that.
That's funny. Where the herd at? All right. Well, let's move on to Elsie Crowninshield, which, by the way, can we just all acknowledge that the name Crowninshield is such a great name? I mean, I have long suffered with the last name Noseworthy, and I would much rather be a Crowninshield.
Sounds very English.
Yes. In the upper right corner, you can see Elsie hard at work, although to me, it's very clear that is a posed photo, but still I love it. Hard at work in her kitchen. This would have been in the back of the building that we now call TPAC. This photo also hangs in the Elsie Crowninshield kitchen, which is currently part of the Craig Dining Hall. You can see in the lower right, the Elwell's holding court in the dining hall. I will note that that is the dining hall prior to its addition being put on. So you'll see it's got a bit of a flat front there. Later, that building was extended. And if you are ever curious to understand the exact size of the addition, all you have to do is walk in TPAC and look down. The old dining hall has a totally different colored floor from the addition, and it's really, really obvious where they extended the building. And then on the left there is, I'm almost pretty sure that that's Elsie. I've gone through the photos and I've actually compared noses to try to figure it out, and the glasses and the hairline. But what we're seeing in the upper right is Elsie when she originally came to camp and then left. She's sitting next to Martie. That is obviously much later. Now, Elsie Crowninshield was, let me just move this out of the way, was from Jamaica, Vermont. She was the Elwell era chef from 1935 to 1970. She personally oversaw the production of tens of thousands of meals for thousands of campers and staff throughout her tenure. She was loved and respected, but she was feared, which is not unusual for the leadership style in the Elwell era. So she established very strict food handling, preparation, and cleaning standards and processes. And I'll tell you how I know that. I know that because we had some problems before Elsie got there. She was certainly not the first and not the last cook, but she was the first to really come in and say, you have to stop handling each individual meal as a project and start handling food preparation and planning as a strategy for camp. So she really changed us from, boy, we got to make dinner, to we have to plan out a summer of meals. So a lot of the strict food handling, preparation, and cleaning standards and processes that we use today, while a lot of them are driven by what's called ServSafe certifications, which are all of our cooks have to have in order to run a commercial grade kitchen like what we have at Camp Takodah. But for those of you who've done kitchen crew, you remember your procedures. A lot of that started with Elsie. So the food safety that we have nowadays is really, the foundation was laid down by Elsie Crowninshield. And Uncle Oscar begged her to return year after year, knowing that Elsie's directive style produced excellent meals for campers and staff alike. And remember, Oscar was like that. You loved and respected the man, but you feared him as well. Same with Francis, right? On Francis. During the year, Elsie was the cook at the Northfield Christian School, also known as the Northfield Normal School, now known as Northfield Mount Hermon, when Northfield Normal Christian and Mount Hermon came together. So that's what she did, and then she summered at Takodah. She lived to be 102 years young and spent her last years at the Gill Oddfellows Nursing Home in Ludlow, Vermont, where she passed away on August the 18th, 1996. So, where did Elsie cook? Well, most of her efforts were in the original dining hall, which we now call the Takodah Performing Arts Center, or TPAC. In the upper right corner, you can see the dining hall shortly after it was built in the late 1920s, so definitely prior to her getting there. But when she got there, it didn't look much different. There was just more grass around it. You remember the familiar fireplace that is there with those fans that make quite a bit of sound. And of course, the outside of the dining hall, you can see at the bottom, and I'll tell you why I chose that picture. Now, Elsie had rudimentary equipment, which Oscar and Francis worked to improve year after year. And it was done almost entirely based on donations. And all of those purchases were noted in reports to the board. So as I've read through our documents, you'll find new oven purchased. Now, what's funny is it rarely ever says for camp. It almost always says for Elsie. And that's what cracks me up, is she was such a staple at camp that when they were trying to improve the facilities and the equipment in camp, they were actually improving it for her, knowing that she would be willing to come back. So that was part of that begging process that Oscar did year after year. Now, some of the equipment she used, including the ice chests and cold storage, is currently in use at camp. If you go into TPAC and you go backstage, there's a whole bunch of large brown things back there, and they're used to store board games and costumes. Those are ice chests. Those were used by Elsie. The camp's store, which you see in this sunset picture below, that's where the camp store is now. That was Elsie's ice house. So they would harvest ice from Cass Pond, and there were subsequent buildings that stored more ice in hay. But when the ice was being moved from storage to get ready for production or to be used to keep massive amounts of food cold, it was put into that building. And that's why that building is partially sunk, because it would keep the ice cold. Here's what's really interesting. I learned in the records that that section is not an original section of the building. That was actually a 24-foot section that was attached and behind Hobby Nook. That was where the original food storage was. So when they had to improve and expand the kitchen operations to build, when they expanded TPAC, they simply took that section off the building and moved it over. How it was attached and how it modified Hobby Nook, I'm not sure we'll ever figure that out. I've really tried, because it doesn't quite line up when you go and look at it. But that's where that originally was. That entire section here was actually behind Hobby Nook. Before I move on to Martie, any questions about Elsie Crowninshield? Such a cool name, Crowninshield. All right, Martie. The legend, Martie Fisher, the holder of a CT-48. I'm going to put an asterisk on that for a minute, because she actually had more, and I'll tell you why. These pictures are, I love these pictures. You can see Martie in all her glory, pictured outside the office, working with Uncle Oscar and Aunt Frances, standing with members of the Takodah community. Martie is a legend. She was born March the 28th, 1928 in Keene. She lived in a house that was actually right across the street from the old Y office. They knew her, she knew them. She graduated from Keene High in 1946 and immediately began a full-time job working for both the Keene YMCA and Cheshire County YMCA. There was a brief time where they had what was called the Monadnock Association, and they were actually combined at one point. She had previously worked for the Y part-time, so Martie essentially only ever throughout her entire career had one job, and that was at our Y. She served her entire career where she operated the camp office and registration. In fact, I love to tell the story that, and it's in the records. I actually found the document again earlier tonight. In the late 1950s, now, for those of you that don't know Martie, she's a wonderful individual, but she will not hesitate to give you her fair and frank opinion, to just put it bluntly. She just tells it like it is. There is no filter on Martie at all. And the office, which is one of the oldest buildings on camp. In fact, it was there in 1919 when we took possession of the property. It had no side. It was awful. It looked awful on the inside. It was run down. And Uncle Oscar was so worried that she would be miserable working in there that he actually had the interior of the office paneled in wood paneling that Martie liked, to literally, quote unquote, keep her happy. And he actually put that into the records, which fascinated me. Now, I know we all talk about the Elwell's century of service to our camp, and that they are holders of CT-50s. They are the only holders of CT-50s. Martie is a holder of a CT-48 plus. And I say 48 plus. She's the longest tenured Takodian. She actually got up to 52, but she refused to take any CTs after 48 out of respect and admiration for the Elwells. She felt that they deserved the 50, nobody else deserved the 50, so she would no longer take a 48.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
She's a better person than I would have been, because I would have taken that 52. I mean, I think that's really nice of her, but she earned those.
She really did, Taylor.
She earned those, and she shouldn't have felt like it would be disrespectful to the other people that stopped at 50 or whatever if she kept going with the 52. I mean, I just wanted to say that.
Well, but you know, God, this isn't going to sound right, especially for people who watch this someday in the future, but Elwells will put on a bit of a pedestal.
Yeah.
And they were on that pedestal for a long time. And at the end, when it was sort of time for them to go, I think there were a lot of people that just wanted to ensure that their legacy was intact, and I think she was one of them. So I don't think that she would have thought it was disrespectful. In fact, I think she has her CT-44 on in that image. I think it was just the tradition had been laid down that they had the 50, so she wanted to just keep it at that. But in 1992, the Fisher Award was created, and in 1993, the office was renamed in her honor. It actually is the Martie Fisher Administrative Building. Now, we still benefit from her registration records, her procedures, her policies. Many of her documents and registration cards are still referenced today. And believe it or not, I just saw her myself not long ago. She still visits camp from time to time and never, ever hesitates to offer her opinion and advice. In fact, I'll never forget, she came up to me and it still blows my mind away that she knows who I am and remembers me as a camper and all this. I mean, she remembers everybody. It's astounding. But she literally looked at me and I said, "Oh, hi, Marty. Welcome back to camp." She said, "Oh, hi. What's with that North Village thing? I tell you, I don't know if I like that. I don't know what to think about that North Village." And she just went on and on. And it was, and she was just, "Oh, I don't like this and I don't like that. And you got to do this and you got to do," and it was so funny because she just like clicked right back into it. And it was really great to see. Before I move on from Marty, I want to share, I got a document here that Uncle Jeff and Bill Allen, I still call him Uncle Rusty, shared with me. And it's actually her words. So she says, on opening days, especially for girls' camp, the line of cars waiting to check in at 2 o'clock stretched down the camp road from May Lane to the main road and along Route 119. Some families brought their lunch, and it was like reunion day. Getting a top bunk was a priority, and you had to be early. You had to be early to be sure you got one. For any of us that were campers, I mean, we all remember that. Assembling on the road was a real treat. Until the 1970s, the whole Cheshire County YMCA Camp Takodah office was moved from Keene to the camp office in Richmond. After the purchase of our own building on Leverett Street, we hired a summer camp office person, and the main office remained in Keene year-round. I missed camp, but I would always go down for opening days in candlelight. And then she talks about how beautiful candlelight was, and who would have thought. Now, this is the most Marty line. She's just going on and on about how beautiful camp was and the silenced trees and watching everybody go and the light getting brighter. And then she says, who would have thought that 250 people could be quiet for so long? Which, it's just so Marty. The only sounds were the wind in the pines, the occasional footsteps, and bullfrogs at the lake. Just a couple of more shares from Marty. She talks about generations of campers coming to camp and what an honor it was to know, the mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and get to know these whole families of Takodians. She knew both me and my brother, for example, and all of our friends that went there. And it was really, really cool how she talks about how that's a really important part of the registration process. It's not just the joy of knowing the people, but it's actually part of her process. She then, the last one I'll share, she says, we had 2 trucks in camp. One, an ancient dump truck called Leaping Lena, which was not registered for the road, and a Ford stake truck in which campers were transported to climb Mount Monadnock. Then she says, imagine doing that this day and age. There was so much sorrow in camp when the vehicles were sold. Actually, the last thing that she talks about, and it's funny because she actually mentions Elsie, is picking blueberries. She loved watching the campers pick the blueberries and watch Elsie turn them into delicious things for the campers to eat. Now, I mentioned that we still benefit from Marty's work, and in fact, we do. We still have all of the stacks on stacks on stacks of registration cards, which were filled out by the families, stamped or notated by Marty, and we have saved them and we still use them. The one on the bottom is mine. That is my mother's, that is my father's handwriting. And that is, that was filled out for when I was 8 years old for my first year at camp. It looks like in my application for 1983. And it says in the upper right corner with E. Epstein, Evan Epstein. Now, Evan and his brother Adam went to Camp Takodah. That they were friends of my family. That's how we found out about Camp Takodah. My brother was friends with Adam. I was friends with Evan. We all went to camp together. But the card on the top I want to point out too. Now, the card on the top actually predates Martie, but it's important to note how far back and the ways in which we use these old things that you might not think are any use. The card on the top is for a gentleman named George Toomey, and you will see in the upper right corner, it is marked dead, World War II. We actually used these cards in order to confirm the names that are on the plaque in Memorial Lodge, and it was these cards that formed the foundation of the information that kicked off for the whole World War II project we did. You can also see in the upper right, left corner, it says PD. That means paid. So the good news is George Toomey doesn't owe any money to Camp Takodah. Any questions about Martie Fisher before I move on to the Kingfish?
Would you mind just moving back to the first pictures you had of her? There was the series of 4. Does that look like? Sorry, we're looking at the picture in the bottom right-hand corner. Is it Uncle Oscar? Is that who's
This
in
is
that
Uncle
picture
Oscar.
with her
This
in the
is
bottom
Aunt
right-hand
Frances.
corner?
Yep. Oscar, Frances, Martie, and I don't know who this is, but this woman is also in. Oh, looks like those 2 photos were taken the same night. Okay, I just noticed that.
Yeah.
But I don't know who that is.
We were just curious as to who's in that picture. Thank you.
Yep. This is late into, I'd say this is probably mid 60s is my guess. Oscar's getting up there. Great question. Any other questions about Martie? All right. The Kingfish. Now, this is a man that is legendary for lots of us, myself included. Ken Kingfish Klatka is the proud holder of a CT-17. And these are just, and I want to thank Ryan for taking the time to help me discover these pictures. I normally have so much more to share, but with everybody on lockdown and I'm working from home and I can't get to the archives like I used to. I know it's a little different here in Massachusetts than it is up there, but still, Ryan, I really appreciated you helping me gather these photos. In the upper left corner, you can see Kingfish looking back at the camera like, what are you doing? Clearly, running his operation during girls' camp. One thing I love about that photo is the tower that's in the background, which is the tower that I grew up jumping off of and was absolutely terrified to do so, which is very different from the tower we have now because the ladder on that tower was straight. So when you had to climb it, you were actually leaning back to climb up, which is crazy dangerous, and they would never do that now. But I get a kick out of that. You can see him. It's really important, and you'll get this from the bio, but Kingfish did not just live on the waterfront. This was a man that was part of the operation through and through. So he's in some skit there. You can see him during a 10-year CT ceremony in the chapel, and then pointing to something with his property of Springfield College t-shirt. And let me tell you something. Ken Kingfish Klatka was property of Springfield College. Another great Y professional coming out of Springfield, but he actually did his entire career at Springfield College. He was an associate and then professor of physical education from 1970 to 2016 when he retired. He was Springfield College's longest serving head coach for Division III track and field from 1975 to 2016. He was the 32nd coach inducted into the Springfield College Athletic Hall of Fame in 2011, and I can assure you that is a very big deal. If you were to walk around that room, you would see he is in the company of very famous people. And he was the waterfront director at Camp Takodah from 74 to 1990. He established many of the water safety procedures and policies that are still in use today. So just like Buff's influence, just like Elsie's influence, just like Martie's influence, we have the influence of Kingfish as well. He had additional special responsibilities for Camp Takodah's ceremonies, so I remember him a lot, not only on the waterfront, but I also remember him doing a lot of the services, including CT ceremonies, 10-year jackets, candlelight service, and Sunday chapel. For those of you who were there in the times at which he was there, he was a real commanding presence around camp. I learned in our records that he received his legendary nickname from an unknown camper who was overheard telling his friend that Ken was, quote unquote, our Kingfish. Somebody overheard that, and the name stuck from that day on. I personally could not possibly imagine calling him anything but Kingfish. I recently had the pleasure of having him and his wife at camp, Sue, and I gave them a tour around camp, and I just called him Kingfish the whole time. And I at one point said to him, I don't know if I'm supposed to call you Mr. Klatka, but I can't possibly imagine calling you that. And he said, no, please, when I'm here, I'm Kingfish. And so he still visits camp. He still sounds the same. He still looks the same. And it was great to see him. I also recently, thanks to Ryan, we found this dedication page from when he received his CT 14. It actually says Takodah's Kingfish, talks about some of the people that he really worked with and influenced, Holly Washburn, Melita Splydell, and it talks about the fact that his role was all over camp and was a real leadership, a real quality of leadership. And so that is the way in which he is remembered. I also remember him wearing this kind of iconic track jacket and carrying a bullhorn around. In fact, one of the stories I like to tell is my fellow campers and I, we were a tricky group. We were not the most well-behaved. And one day we got on the raft and we actually untied it. I don't remember if it was myself or my friend Matt Carey or Evan Epstein or some of the other names some folks on the phone may recognize, but we actually untied it from its mooring and started pushing it out to the middle of Cass Pond. And I just remember Kingfish hollering at us on the bullhorn. And then he made us do a lot of work. And second chances are always a powerful thing at Camp Takodah. Nobody's perfect. Everybody makes mistakes, and that's okay. But making up for those mistakes, accepting them, paying your dues is an important part. And Kingfish was one of those individuals. And when he retired, actually wrote him a letter, told him that story, and I included a photograph I had of the very first time I ever jumped into Cass Pond. My father caught the moment, and I'm getting my swim test, and he's standing right next to me. Now, here's another photo we found today. I love this photo. Bruce Holloway on the left, Uncle Jeff in the middle, of course, with the popped collar, and Ken Kingfish Klatka on the right. I think this is out at the point. I'm not 100% sure, but you could see a clipboard behind them. You can see Kingfish has his hand up. Bruce is talking, and Jeff and Ken are listening. And oh, to be a fly on that rock. Can you imagine what that conversation might have, could have, should have, would have been? I would love to know. I mean, obviously they're deep in conversation about something that they are planning or thinking through or dealing with. And I loved this moment. I love this photograph. I hold these gentlemen in high regard. And I'm lucky enough to still communicate with some of them. Now, I'm going to open it up again. If anybody has any questions or stories or anything to share or anything to clarify or correct, mind you, please feel free to do that and let me know.
So, Graham, just a couple of things from the chat box. Jonathan mentioned that he was a camper Kingfish's first summer, and that summer they all were required to call him Mr. Klatka. So Kingfish must be
as well as a lot of the counselors. I remember we were told, it was Uncle Oscar and Aunt Frances, but everyone else was like who was it? Ken Sue was Mr. Sue. Mr. Frazee, Mike Frazee's dad in the nurses. Everything was.
Oh yeah,
by
yep.
Mr.
That is
And I
hilarious.
think that some of the counselors, I sort of remember, like Hammerhand. I think we have a call him Mr. Hammerhand at times, Mike Hammerhand.
Michael?
Yeah, and Listernick and a couple others from way back. Doug Murray, Mr. Murray. He got kicked out though. Uncle Oscar caught him drinking probably 12 states away on his day off somehow.
I
Only
love
Uncle
those
Oscar
stories.
could do.
I love those. One of my favorite stories is the guy who on his deathbed is having a drink with Bill Allen, and Oscar's been dead for 20 years or something, and he turns to Bill and says, "Don't tell Uncle Rusty. I mean, don't tell Uncle Oscar." And I love that. Anything else, folks? Any other questions? I got a couple of other things to share, and then we'll call it a night.
The other thing is Mike asked if you had a picture of Buff's grave site that you could share, the stone.
I sure do. I sure do. Let me.
So where's Bill Allen today, or Jeff Craig?
They both live in the area, and they actually help out a lot with me and all the history work, and they're around from time to time. Here's a picture of Buffalo's gravestone at the East Cemetery in Hollis. You can see his buffalo. Let me see if I can blow this up a little bit for you folks. Nope, this system's weird. It won't let me blow it up. But if you look closely, you can see there's a little buffalo right here, the Canadian flag that I mentioned in the middle for Catherine, and then the airplane here for Eugene with the mountains in the background. It's a beautiful little stone, but it's also important to note that the stone that originally marked Buffalo's grave at Camp Takodah is still in place. It is still there right behind the altar. And it's important to note that one of the things we learned recently when we were researching the history of the Elwell Chapel is that the altar, I thought it was just like somebody just built it, right? That it had like a stone veneer. It was just stones put in place. Every single one of those stones that is part of that chapel altar were sent in by alumni. Each one of those stones represents a different alumni of Camp Takodah. And then you'll see here is wicker armchairs with the color picture of "Have you been buffed today?" Love that picture. Also love how you can see the lights are on in the dining hall. And this is where you can actually hear Buffs singing. And I really want to recommend you do that.
Yeah, so Graham, I dropped that link into the chat box. So if anybody's looking for an easy way to get there, you scroll through the chat, you'll find that link.
Great. All right, a couple of more things. Can
I just make a quick note about
please.
Thank you. The Buff's original grave site, the stone that's behind the chapel. We, as the family, had been kind of putting flowers and plantings and whatever there. The past couple of years with all the issues in the chapel, that hasn't been happening, but each year, hopefully it's being set out. Of course, not this year maybe, but there's a bench also that my brother-in-law made for that area as a nice place to sit down by the lake near the site. We all think of Buff as still being there. I don't think of him as being in Hollis. I think of him as being there. So we wanted to make it a really nice gathering spot. I think there's plans in the works for kind of revamping that area. So once it is, we're hoping to put make it more like a garden area for people to sit and enjoy themselves.
So Diane, first of all, I love that. And yes, the bench is still there in his use. And yes, as part of the master site planning, we just recently did a pretty darn good temporary repair to the chapel. So, I mean, it was thoroughly destroyed at one point just from runoff, and just from age, but it's been refurbished for now. It will eventually be reconstructed as part of the master site plan, but that bench is there. And I want you to know, we all think of him as there as well. I'm sharing tonight that he was moved to Hollis just because it's part of his biography, but we actually don't talk about that when we're there, or I don't at least. A lot of people still think of him spiritually and physically as remaining within camp. and he is very much a part of it. So thank you for saying that. And I think the idea of the plants and garden, things like that, is just wonderful. And what's even better is it keeps that name alive and keeps that story moving. So let's continue to do that.
Yeah, and the stone down there is beautiful. If you haven't,
It's so
I don't-
gorgeous.
But if other people haven't seen it, it's quite a beautiful stone. All right.
Just go right behind the altar and you can see it. All right, so I always like to share something new because it's important to note that we are constantly discovering new stuff. And this one really just cracked me up. I love this. And if anybody would like to see the full expanded version of this, I'm happy to share it as well. But this is a flyer from the stupendous, gigantic Takodah Water Circus that recently surfaced on eBay. It is from July the 27th, 1935. It says, big program at waterfront. It's interesting to notice that in the 30s, and I don't know when this faded, but for a while, water and front were two words. Nowadays, they aren't. In the records, they haven't been. They've been one word, waterfront, for a long time. There was a craft exhibit with booths. There was an evening program. And it says that they were serving sandwiches, puppies. I'm not sure that meant they were cooking live dogs. Hamburgers, brownies, sherbet, milk, coffee, pop, not soda, but pop, will be sold. And the admission was 25 cents for adults or 10 cents for children. And there's some other wonderful things that we've discovered in this collection that I'm actually working to acquire this from this local antique dealer, but they're putting up a bit of a fight, and that's okay. I'll get through that. But I was able to get these digital copies, so at least we have something in our records. But I just love this little seal and the firework and all this great stuff.
I have a question about the cards.
Question about the cards?
The registration cards?
Sure, yep.
Because you said that you used those to help you, you know, you did the research on the campers who had died in World War II.
Yep.
So that's a great archival document that you were able to pull up to find information from. Are we still filling these out when kids come to camp, or is it all online now?
So it's all digital, which from an archival standpoint is actually better. And I'll tell you why, because when you have physical assets, all the searching has to be done manually, individually, piece by piece. Now, I mean, they're in alphabetical order for the most part, but there's thousands of them. And obviously when things are digital, you can just do a search. But I'll give you an example, Taylor, of where this came in handy recently. There was an old Takodian reached out to me and said that she had recently had a dream about a friend of hers from camp. They were best friends at the time and went to camp together, but as happens, they had drifted apart, and she knew her name but didn't know anything about her. So I took the name, took what I thought were the years, gave them to Linda in the office. Linda went down into the stacks, pulled the cards, confirmed the woman's name. We figured out she lived in New York. I did my private investigator thing, tracked her down, made a cold call and just say, hey, look, this is who I am. And when I got on the phone, I said, now there's a friend of yours from camp that's trying to connect with you. She immediately said the name, started crying and said, where is she? They've been reconnected and they are now the best of friends again. And that is because of records that we have kept over the years. So they're very, very powerful things.
Right, but I'm saying that 50 years from now, when you're trying to, like, I don't know, look up somebody that's now president of the United States that went to Camp Takodah, where would you find that? Where would somebody find that information? They would have to go to an online source if we're not filling out the cards anymore.
Right. So technically, the staff are the only ones that have access to the cards. In the future, my guess is because of personally identifiable information and at IBM where I work, we call them GDPR laws. That information will be restricted, but there could be a registration database that has names and years that potentially someday could be made available for searching. So if you look at like a lot of colleges and universities, they've digitized a lot of their records, and they make their digital records available as well. So in the future, I would imagine two things will happen. These records will have been digitized and combined with the digital records that we are capturing in the 2000s era, because still for a long time everything was all paper. But there's a lot of work to kind of combine all of those together, but someday it'll just be a search. So it's a great question. And the answer is, it'll probably end up being some sort of a mix of both, but the information will be there.
Thank you.
Okay. Shared this. Just a reminder that, camp is a place of extraordinary beauty, and it's a wonderful community, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate having you join us tonight, especially Buff's family. Having a chance to see Dennis with his Viking beard, of course, was a real treasure. Taylor, Sue, everybody who joined us. But just remember, your stories count as well. So we want you to share those stories with us, and you can do that by working with me, especially if there's someone you want to track down, or a story that you feel is good, or maybe you know something like, where did the bell come from, or how did we start up with the big chairs, or at what point did we get the red boats at camp, or whatever it might be. Little things, little clues, little stories make a big difference to historians. And then this is it for my Takodah history talk. So if you've got a topic or something you want me to research, let me know. I always like to share these little pictures. The one on the bottom, that's me in a little nerdy Izod shirt with those god-awful shorts my mother made me wear. That's the Epstein brothers, and my sister behind me, and my brother in a classic Takodah shirt. You can see the badminton courts behind us, and that's my brother and I, my brother and me just a couple of years ago. Don't worry, I'm not standing on anything, or I'm actually much bigger than my brother. You'll just have to believe me when I tell you that. I'm not. I'm standing on a bench. He's much bigger than I am. But if you have any ideas, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, as I like to say, day is done, gone the sun, and good night, Takodians. Thank you for joining our Takodah History Talk.
Yeah, and again, I just want to circle back to where I started with a huge thank you to Graham for all of this work. I know from a staff perspective, we appreciate him more than he could ever know, and I know that all the countless alumni who he talks to and helps, yeah, I know exactly the woman who he's talking about with Reconnecting Friends, are so deeply appreciative. So thank you. I hope you'll reach out to Graham as he requested if you're interested in something or have some history to share. And otherwise, we'll get all these history talks up on the website soon. Otherwise, thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night. Enjoy the rest of your summer. And
Jonathan, I owe you a phone call. I haven't forgotten yet.
That's okay. I'm not going anywhere.
Neither am I, exactly.
Might try to go to the office in a week or so to see what's going on, but other than that, I'm here.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ryan.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham.